In the vast body of the Buddha's teachings, there is perhaps no concept more central, more foundational, and more misunderstood than the idea of dukkha. Often translated simply as suffering, this word holds far more depth and nuance than the English term might suggest. To understand the path taught by the Buddha, one must begin not with abstract philosophy or rituals, but with a direct, unflinching encounter with this reality of dukkha. It is the very first truth the Buddha spoke of after his awakening. It is not a side topic or a pessimistic assertion, but the cornerstone of the entire spiritual journey. When the Buddha gave his first discourse, the famous teaching known as the Four Noble Truths, he began with a bold and universal statement. This is the noble truth of dukkha. It was not a religious claim, nor was it something one needed to believe in. It was an invitation to observe one's own life honestly. Everyone, regardless of culture, belief, or background, has tasted some form of dissatisfaction. Whether it is the pain of loss, the stress of anxiety, the frustration of unmet expectations, or the quiet restlessness that follows even moments of happiness, dukkha touches every human life. This teaching is not meant to discourage or depress us. In fact, the Buddha's motivation was compassion. He saw that unless we recognize and understand this condition of human life, we will continue to chase illusions and suffer needlessly. The teaching on dukkha is the gateway to liberation. To ignore it is to stay trapped in cycles of discontent. To face it is to begin the path to peace. The challenge for many people today is that the word suffering seems too dramatic. They may say, "But I'm not suffering. I'm fine." That is why it is essential to understand that dukkha refers not just to obvious pain, but to the subtler, persistent sense that things are not quite right. Even in moments of pleasure or success, there is an undercurrent of fear that it will not last. Even in a comfortable life, there is a vague sense of something missing, something unfulfilled. The Buddha called attention to this because he wanted us to stop running in circles, forever seeking contentment in things that cannot provide lasting peace. In this lecture, we will explore this essential teaching in depth. We will examine what dukkha really means, not just as an idea, but as a living reality we all experience. We will look at how it manifests in our daily lives, how it is connected to the way we perceive the world and ourselves, and how it forms the starting point of the Buddha's path. This is not an academic study, but a practical reflection. The goal is not to learn about suffering as a concept, but to begin to understand our own experience with clarity and honesty. Throughout this talk, we will also challenge some common misunderstandings. The Buddha did not say that life is only suffering, nor did he teach that we should reject life. Instead, he offered a vision of life that is clear-eyed and realistic. He taught that we should see life as it is, not as we wish it to be. Only then can we truly be free, not by escaping life, but by understanding it so deeply that we are no longer caught by its ups and downs. Understanding dukkha is not an end in itself. It is the beginning of wisdom. It is the necessary foundation for compassion, because only when we understand our own pain can we truly connect with the pain of others. And it is the key to letting go, not out of despair, but out of the deep insight that clinging leads only to frustration. In learning to see dukkha clearly, we are not moving toward darkness but toward light. Let us now begin this journey by looking closely at what dukkha really means, not just in theory, but in the living reality of our minds and bodies. Let us take the first step that the Buddha himself encouraged, the step that opens the door to a deeper, freer way of being. To begin understanding dukkha deeply, we must look beyond the surface of its usual translation as suffering. This word, while useful in some cases, often leads to misunderstanding. People tend to associate suffering with only extreme forms of pain, such as physical injury, heartbreak, or war. But the teaching of dukkha covers a much broader range of human experience. It points to a fundamental instability and dissatisfaction that underlies all conditioned existence. Dukkha can be found in both obvious and subtle places. It is not limited to moments of despair or crisis. In fact, it is often most persistent in the background of ordinary life, in the way we are constantly leaning into the next moment, hoping that the next experience, achievement, or possession will finally make us feel complete. But even when we get what we want, the relief is temporary. Soon, a new desire arises. The cycle continues. Dukkha is not only about what goes wrong. It's also about the deep restlessness that remains even when things seem to go right. One helpful way to approach this teaching is to recognize that dukkha appears in three major forms. First, there is the suffering of pain, both physical and emotional. This is the most visible form, and it includes illness, injury, grief, anxiety, depression, and disappointment. Everyone can relate to this level. But the Buddha pointed out that even if we could avoid all physical and emotional pain, we would still not be free from dukkha. The second kind of dukkha is the suffering that comes from change. This includes the loss of things we value, the fading of pleasures, and the realization that nothing stays the same. Even joyful experiences carry within them the seed of dukkha because they are temporary. A beautiful moment cannot be held onto. A loved one cannot be protected forever. Good health, youth, status, and success all slip away, no matter how tightly we try to hold them. This type of dukkha is subtle but universal. It is the sadness that lingers at the edge of happiness, the anxiety that follows satisfaction, the quiet fear that something precious might be lost. The third kind of dukkha is more profound and more difficult to see. It refers to the deep discomfort that comes simply from being caught in a world of conditions. Everything we experience is dependent on countless other factors: our moods, our bodies, our relationships, our memories, the weather, the economy, and more. We are not truly in control, and this lack of control is unsettling. Even when life feels stable, that stability is fragile. Beneath the surface, there is a tension in always needing things to go a certain way. This form of dukkha is built into the structure of conditioned life itself. It is not caused by a specific event. It is the sense that something is always slightly off, never quite enough. These three types of dukkha together give us a more complete picture of what the Buddha meant. He was not just pointing to pain, but to the entire structure of human experience when it is based on craving, clinging, and misunderstanding. Dukkha is not something outside of us. It is in the way we relate to life. It shows up in how we resist discomfort, chase pleasure, fear loss, and grasp at control. It's in the way we construct our identity and try to defend it, the way we tell ourselves that happiness depends on things staying the same when, in fact, everything is always changing. Understanding the scope of dukkha allows us to develop a more compassionate and wise view of our lives. Instead of judging ourselves for feeling restless or dissatisfied, we begin to see that this restlessness is not personal. It is a natural part of the human condition. We can stop blaming ourselves or others for not feeling completely at peace. We can begin to observe this universal pattern with curiosity and gentleness. This clarity also helps us let go of the idea that happiness can be permanently secured through external means. We stop expecting perfect satisfaction from careers, relationships, possessions, or status. We still engage with life, but with more balance and less desperation. We learn to appreciate what is here without needing it to last. We begin to recognize that the search for lasting fulfillment through temporary things is, itself, a form of dukkha. By expanding our view of dukkha, we open the door to wisdom. We begin to ask deeper questions. Not just, how can I get what I want? But why do I want this? Not just, how can I avoid pain? But what is my relationship to pain? These are the questions that lead to insight. The Buddha was not trying to scare or discourage us. He was inviting us to stop running and look clearly. Dukkha, when seen fully, becomes the path to freedom. It is not an enemy to fight, but a reality to understand. In this understanding, a new possibility begins to emerge. A life not free from all pain, but free from the confusion that turns pain into suffering. To truly understand dukkha, we must move from abstract ideas to direct experience. The teaching of dukkha is not meant to be a distant theory or something that only applies to monks or philosophers. It is about our own lives, here and now. Dukkha is not something we have to search for. It is already present, woven into the fabric of our daily experience. By paying careful attention, We can begin to see how this condition expresses itself in everything from the most obvious forms of suffering to the most subtle forms of dissatisfaction. At the most visible level, dukkha shows up in the physical and emotional pain that all of us encounter. It appears when the body is sick or injured, when we feel tired or weak, when aging brings limitations we cannot avoid. It also shows up in the mind, in feelings of sadness, anxiety, fear, frustration, loneliness, and grief. These experiences are part of being human. No one escapes them, no matter how privileged or protected their life may seem. We may try to avoid or suppress these forms of pain, but they return again and again, reminding us that we are not in full control. Yet there are deeper layers to dukkha that are often harder to name. One of the most common is the sense of disappointment. We make plans, build expectations, and hope for certain outcomes, but life does not always follow our script. Perhaps we apply for a job and don't get it. Perhaps a relationship ends despite our efforts to maintain it. Perhaps we work hard and still don't feel fulfilled. Even when things seem to go well, we often find that the satisfaction doesn't last. A promotion may bring a temporary sense of success, but soon a new desire arises. A vacation may offer moments of pleasure, but it ends and we return to the same routines. This pattern of craving, achievement, and dissatisfaction is not a failure on our part. It is part of how the human mind works when it is caught in a cycle of endless wanting. Dukkha also appears in the inevitable experiences of loss. We lose people we love. We lose opportunities. We lose our youth. Nothing remains the same. We may try to hold on to what we care about, but change happens anyway. Friends move away, parents grow old, children become independent, and time passes. There is sorrow in this, even if we accept it intellectually. And when we resist these changes, when we cling to what is fading, the sorrow deepens. There is also the suffering that comes with comparison and competition. In a world where we are constantly exposed to images of other people's success, beauty, or happiness, it is easy to feel that our own life is lacking. We compare ourselves to others, and this leads to envy, insecurity, and a sense of not being good enough. We fear falling behind. We fear being unnoticed. We live under pressure to prove our worth, to appear strong and accomplished. Even those who seem to have it all often live with anxiety about losing what they have, or with the hidden burden of feeling empty despite outer success. Even comfort itself can become a cause of dukkha. When life becomes too comfortable, we often develop fear. We fear change. We fear loss. We become attached to our routines, our possessions, our relationships, our identities. The more we have, the more we fear losing. This fear creates tension in the mind. It becomes harder to relax. Even moments of happiness carry a shadow of unease, because we know they are temporary. Perhaps the most subtle form of dukkha in daily life is the feeling that something is missing, even when nothing seems wrong. Many people live with a quiet sense of restlessness. They keep busy, chase goals, and fill their time, but deep down there is a lingering discomfort, a sense that they are never fully at ease, never fully satisfied. They may not be suffering in any dramatic way, but they are also not truly at peace. This sense of something not quite right is a core aspect of dukkha. It is not caused by any one thing, but by the mind's habit of clinging, resisting, and seeking. All of these forms of dukkha, pain, disappointment, loss, fear, restlessness, are part of our everyday existence. They are not the result of doing something wrong. They are simply what happens when the mind is caught in wanting things to be different than they are. The Buddha did not point this out to make us feel hopeless. He pointed it out so that we would stop looking for lasting peace in the wrong places. When we begin to see dukkha clearly in our daily lives, we develop a different kind of strength. We no longer need to pretend that everything is perfect. We no longer need to hide from our pain or cover it up with distractions. Instead, we can meet our experience with honesty. We can begin to relate to life in a new way, not by pushing away what is unpleasant or grasping at what is pleasant, but by observing, understanding, and letting go. This shift does not make life painless, but it does make life more spacious, more grounded, more real. We learn to live with the full range of experience without being overwhelmed. We learn to care for our pain and the pain of others with compassion. And we begin to taste a different kind of happiness, not the fragile happiness of getting what we want, but the steady joy that comes from wisdom and freedom. To understand dukkha more deeply, we must explore how it arises, not just in isolated events, but as part of a natural and repeating process. The Buddha described this process as dependent origination, the chain of conditions through which suffering comes into being. This teaching reveals that dukkha does not happen randomly, nor is it caused by fate or punishment. It arises due to specific causes and conditions, and therefore it can also cease when those causes are understood and removed. Dependent origination begins with something very simple, yet very powerful: ignorance. This is not a lack of book knowledge, but a lack of clear understanding about the nature of life. When we don't see clearly that things are impermanent, unreliable, and not truly ours, we respond in ways that create suffering. From this ignorance, the entire chain begins to unfold. One condition gives rise to another: mental formations, consciousness, mind and body, the six senses, contact, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, and finally aging and death, with all the sorrow, grief, and despair that follow. In this way, dukkha is not just an emotion we feel from time to time. It is the final product of a cycle that begins deep within the way we perceive and react to the world. This chain shows us that dukkha is something we participate in. It is created and recreated each moment, depending on how we meet our experience. At the heart of this process is craving, the urge to hold on to what is pleasant, to push away what is unpleasant, and to become something we are not yet. Craving arises when we have a feeling, whether it's pleasure, pain, or something neutral, and we react to it habitually. If it feels good, we want more. If it feels bad, we want to escape. If it feels neutral, we become bored or indifferent. This craving leads to clinging, and clinging leads to becoming new actions, new identities, new stories we tell ourselves about who we are or who we should be. All of this keeps us locked in a cycle of seeking and disappointment. The suffering we experience is not simply the result of pain or misfortune. It is the result of how our mind relates to those things. It is the attachment to pleasure and the resistance to pain. It is the belief that we must always have control, that we must always be someone or have something to be complete. These habits of mind are deeply rooted, but they are not permanent. The Buddha taught that when we clearly see the process at work, we can begin to interrupt it. We can stop feeding the cycle with ignorance and craving. We can meet our feelings with awareness rather than reactivity. In modern life, this process is happening constantly. For example, imagine you receive a compliment. Feels good. That pleasant feeling leads to a desire for more praise. You begin to shape your behavior to win approval. You become attached to an image of yourself. When criticism comes, it feels painful, not just because of the words, but because it threatens your sense of identity. You resist it, defend yourself, feel upset. This whole drama, from the moment of pleasant feeling to the frustration and tension that follow, is a small example of the chain of conditions. It is how dukkha is born in everyday situations. Or consider the opposite. Someone says something unpleasant. The mind reacts with pain, then with anger or self-doubt. You may replay the conversation in your mind, dwell on it, build a story around it. Again, suffering grows not just from the words spoken, but from the craving to feel safe, respected, or validated. We suffer because we want things to be different than they are, and we do not see clearly the impermanent and impersonal nature of experience. Understanding this process doesn't require us to memorize technical terms or study philosophy. It simply requires us to watch our own minds with interest and honesty. When we begin to notice the pattern, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, we develop a new kind of freedom. We are no longer trapped in automatic reactions. We can pause, breathe, and choose a different response. We can feel pain without turning it into suffering. We can enjoy pleasure without becoming attached to it. Dependent origination shows us that suffering is not a single moment of pain, but a chain of conditions that begins with not seeing clearly. It teaches us that the key to ending dukkha is not to control the world, but to understand the mind. When we see how dukkha arises, we also begin to see how it can cease. And in that understanding, we take the first real steps toward freedom. To understand the roots of dukkha more deeply, the Buddha invited us to examine not just external events, but the very structure of our personal experience. He described this structure in terms of 5 basic elements or aggregates that together make up what we commonly call a person. These 5 aggregates are the body, feelings, perceptions, mental activities, and consciousness. Rather than being a fixed self or soul, what we experience as me is actually a combination of these constantly changing processes. The reason this teaching is so important is because much of our suffering arises from the way we identify with these aggregates. We take them to be who we are. We say, "This is my body. These are my thoughts. This is my feeling. And this is me." But when we look closely, we begin to see that none of these things are stable, lasting, or truly under our control. Each of the aggregates is in a state of continuous change. When we cling to them or build a sense of self around them, we inevitably suffer. Let's begin with the body. Our physical form is constantly aging, changing, and affected by factors beyond our control. We might feel strong and energetic one day, and weak or ill the next. We invest so much attention in our appearance, our health, our strength, but none of it stays the same. No matter how well we care for the body, it is subject to sickness, pain, and eventually death. When we believe the body is our self, every sign of aging or illness feels like a threat. But when we see it as just one temporary aspect of experience, we begin to loosen our grip. Next, we consider feelings. These are the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral sensations that arise based on contact with the world. They come and go constantly. Some last only a few seconds. Yet we often make major decisions based on chasing pleasant feelings or avoiding unpleasant ones. When we don't get the feelings we want, we feel disappointed. When we get them and they pass, we feel frustrated. The habit of reacting to feelings instead of observing them keeps us caught in cycles of craving and dissatisfaction. Perceptions are the ways we recognize and label what we experience. We see a face and recognize it as a friend. We hear a sound and name it. This is a helpful function of the mind, but it is also where bias and misunderstanding can enter. Perception is shaped by memory, opinion, and past experience. We may misinterpret a situation or judge someone unfairly based on old habits of thought. When we cling to our perceptions as absolute truths, we create conflict with reality and with others. The 4th aggregate is mental formations, the thoughts, emotions, and intentions that shape our behavior. These arise from past habits and lead to new actions, creating patterns that affect our lives in powerful ways. We often assume that our thoughts and emotions define us, but when we observe them closely, we see they arise and pass like clouds in the sky. Anger flares up and then fades. Sadness comes and goes. New thoughts replace old ones. If we grasp tightly onto these passing states, we become tangled in confusion and drama. But if we observe them as temporary movements of the mind, we develop clarity and balance. The final aggregate is consciousness, the simple awareness of experiences. It is the knowing quality that lights up each moment. But even consciousness is not fixed. It changes depending on what we are aware of. The consciousness of seeing is different from the consciousness of hearing, smelling, touching, or thinking. It is not a single, unchanging observer behind the scenes, but a dynamic process that arises and passes in response to different conditions. Together, these 5 aggregates make up the totality of our experience. They are not bad or wrong in themselves. The problem arises when we cling to them, when we believe they are permanent, or when we identify with them as our true self. This clinging is what turns the natural flow of life into a source of suffering. The Buddha did not teach us to reject the aggregates, but to investigate them. He encouraged us to look closely and ask, "Is this truly mine? Is this who I am? Can I really control this?" When we begin to answer honestly, we see that each aggregate is inconstant, unreliable, and not worthy of being claimed as a self. This insight is not about becoming detached in a cold or indifferent way. It is about freeing the heart from a mistaken view. When we no longer build our identity on things that are constantly shifting, we begin to experience peace. We stop resisting change. We stop fearing loss. We begin to relate to our experience with more spaciousness and less struggle. Dukkha arises when we misunderstand the nature of experience. It arises when we try to build a permanent self on top of impermanent conditions. By investigating the 5 aggregates, we begin to see through this illusion. We stop asking life to give us something it cannot provide, lasting security in a world of change. And in that realization, we take another step toward liberation, not by escaping life, but by seeing it as it truly is. Up to this point, we have explored what dukkha is and how it operates, from daily life to the deep psychological patterns rooted in our way of experiencing the world. But the real turning point in the Buddha's teaching is not simply the recognition that dukkha exists. It is the understanding that dukkha can be fully known, fully understood, and eventually, fully released. This shift, from experiencing suffering to gaining insight into its nature, is the heart of the path. Insight is not about believing in something new, but about seeing more clearly into the reality we are already living. The Buddha never asked his followers to run away from suffering. In fact, he encouraged them to do the opposite, to turn toward it with open eyes and steady awareness. The path to awakening begins not by escaping pain, but by understanding it thoroughly. This understanding is not intellectual. It is a direct and personal realization that comes through mindfulness, investigation, and reflection. We begin to look into the nature of experience itself, moment by moment, with honesty and curiosity. In this way, we learn not just about suffering, but from it. This insight arises when we stop reacting automatically to what we feel and start observing it with a calm and steady attention. We may feel fear, sadness, or restlessness, but instead of immediately trying to change or avoid the feeling, we watch it. We observe how it arises, how it feels in the body, how it shifts over time, and how it eventually fades away. In this simple practice, we begin to see that no feeling lasts forever. No emotion defines us. Everything is moving, changing, appearing, and disappearing. Through this direct observation, we start to see the 3 characteristics of all conditioned things. They are impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not truly self. When we look at any experience, whether it is a thought, a mood, they arise based on conditions, and they pass away without our control. This is the insight into non-self. This way of seeing slowly transforms our relationship with dukkha. Instead of fighting it, fearing it, or trying to cover it up with distractions, we begin to relate to it as a teacher. Suffering becomes a doorway to wisdom. Each moment of discomfort becomes an invitation to look more closely, to ask, what am I clinging to? What belief or expectation is causing this stress? What fear is behind this pain? By bringing this kind of attention to our experience, we cultivate the space in which insight can arise naturally. We stop adding stories, judgments, or resistance to what is happening. We allow things to be as they are, and in doing so, we begin to see them more clearly. It is in this still and silent space that deep wisdom unfolds. This process is not something that happens all at once. Insight develops gradually, through practice and reflection. It requires patience, sincerity, and a willingness to face life as it is. When we pause and see a thought for what it is, these are all moments of insight. They may seem ordinary, but they are signs of transformation. The insight into dukkha is not a grim realization. It is the beginning of freedom. When we truly understand the nature of suffering, we no longer fear it. We see that much of our distress comes not from what is happening, but from how we relate to it. The great promise of the Buddha's teaching is not simply the recognition that suffering exists, but the realization that it can end. This is what makes the path both practical and hopeful. This possibility is what he called liberation or awakening, not in some distant future or after death, but here and now, within this very life, through our own understanding. And the deep tendency of the mind to resist what is unpleasant and grasp at what is pleasant. The third truth states that if this cause is removed, then suffering ceases. The logic is simple but profound. When the fuel is no longer added, the fire goes out. When we stop feeding the patterns that create stress, they lose their power. This is not a mystical or supernatural idea. It is a truth we can verify through experience. But this does not happen through wishful thinking or blind belief. It happens through the fourth truth, the path that leads to the end of suffering. This path is known as the Noble Eightfold Path. It is a practical guide that includes wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental training. Each part of the path supports the others. Together, they form a way of life that gradually weakens the roots of dukkha and strengthens the causes of freedom. At the heart of this path is a transformation in how we see, how we act, and how we relate to our experience. We begin by developing a clear understanding of the nature of reality, seeing that everything is impermanent, unreliable, and not truly self. This wisdom leads to a more ethical way of living, based on compassion and respect for ourselves and others. And through practices like mindfulness and meditation, we cultivate a mind that is calm, focused, and able to observe experience without being overwhelmed or confused. Ending dukkha does not mean we will never feel pain or sadness again. Life will still bring its challenges, illness, aging. What ends is not the natural flow of life, but the suffering we add to it through misunderstanding. In this way, dukkha becomes not just something to escape from, but a motivation for liberation. When we recognize how often we are caught in cycles of stress, when we feel the weight of our own expectations and reactions, we are moved to find another way. The pain of dukkha becomes the fuel for our practice, not to run from life, but to wake up within it. We begin to see that freedom is not found by fixing the world outside, but by transforming the way we relate to it inside. And this transformation is possible for anyone. The Buddha did not claim to be special or chosen. We need only begin to look more closely, to question our assumptions, to slow down and listen. Each step we take on the path weakens the hold of dukkha and strengthens the light of wisdom. It's also important to understand that the end of dukkha is not a passive state. It is not about numbing the mind or disconnecting from emotion. It is a vibrant, awake, and engaged way of being. When the confusion that causes suffering is gone, what remains is clarity, love, and deep peace. This peace does not depend on circumstances. It is not shaken by success or failure, gain or loss. It is the peace of knowing that we are no longer enslaved by craving, no longer bound by the restless hunger that once drove our thoughts, speech, and actions. Ultimately, the end of dukkha is not found in achieving something new, but in letting go of what is false. It is a return to a natural state of balance. It is the quiet confidence that arises when we no longer need to prove anything, defend anything, or grasp at anything. We begin to live not from fear or desire, but from understanding. In this freedom, life becomes lighter. We are still fully human, still touched by joy and sorrow, still moved by the beauty and fragility of the world. But we are no longer lost in it, and understanding more. As we come to the end of this exploration into the nature of dukkha, it is worth pausing to reflect on the deeper meaning of everything we've considered. From the ordinary frustrations of daily life to the profound existential dissatisfaction that runs beneath our constant search for fulfillment, dukkha touches every part of our experience. It is not something far away or abstract. It is the pressure we feel when things don't go our way, the tension of always needing something more, and the unease that lingers even in moments of success. Dukkha is not a flaw in us. It is a fact of conditioned existence, and the Buddha offered his teachings not to condemn us for it, but to free us from it. Toward freedom. When we stop denying or avoiding our discomfort, we begin to see it clearly. When we see it clearly, we begin to understand its causes. And when we understand the causes, we can begin to let go. The letting go that the Buddha spoke of is not a rejection of life, but a release of the inner habits that create suffering. It is the release of craving, of clinging, of the mistaken belief that lasting satisfaction can be found by controlling or holding on to impermanent things. This release does not require us to become anything other than what we are. It requires us to see what we are clearly and to stop building our identity on what is unreliable. In this way, the teaching is not about changing the world, but about changing how we see and relate to the world. This change begins with small steps. We begin to pay attention. We begin to question our assumptions. We pause when we feel reactive. We listen more deeply, to ourselves, to others, to the truth of the present moment. This kind of mindfulness is not just a technique. It is a way of being that slowly transforms the way we experience everything. With time, we begin to see through the illusions that fuel our suffering. We begin to understand that what we were looking for outside, peace, security, happiness, can only be found within. Through this understanding, we come to realize that dukkha is not the enemy. It is the messenger. It points us back to the places where we are still holding on, still misunderstanding, still searching. And in doing so, it guides us toward wisdom. Every moment of dissatisfaction, every uncomfortable feeling, every experience of restlessness or pain becomes an invitation to return to presence and to see more clearly. When we meet these moments with awareness rather than resistance, we discover that they have something to teach us. They are not obstacles on the path, they are the path. And this path is available to anyone. We don't need to be saints, scholars, or monks to walk it. We only need sincerity, patience, and a willingness to look within. The Buddha was a human being, just like us. His awakening was not a divine gift. It was the result of deep inquiry and honest attention. He discovered a truth that is accessible to all of us, and he left a clear map for others to follow. That map does not require us to believe blindly or follow rituals. It asks us to look at our own lives, our own minds, our own experience, and to see what is true. In the end, the teaching on dukkha is not a teaching of despair, but a teaching of hope. It shows us that we are not doomed to suffer. We are not bound by our habits, our past, or our pain. The causes of suffering can be known, and because they can be known, they can be let go. And when they are let go, what remains is not emptiness or numbness, but a profound sense of peace, a peace that does not depend on anything, a freedom that is not touched by gain or loss, praise or blame, success or failure. This is the heart of the Buddha's teaching.